is Stephen Canetto. I'm the Associate Dean for Community Engagement and Strategic Initiatives at the Mississippi State University Libraries. We're pleased to have today with us Dr. Terry Alford, who is an author and Professor Emeritus of History at Northern Virginia Community College. He received his PhD here at Mississippi State University and did his postdoctoral work in family history at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Alford is the guest speaker for the Franklin Virginia Williams Lecture on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies. He is a founding board member of the Abraham Lincoln Institute of Washington, D.C., and is a recognized authority on John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. In 2015, Oxford University Press published his biography of John Wilkes Booth entitled Fortune's Fool, which received exceptional reviews. His latest book, In the House of Their Dead, The Lincolns, the Booths, and the Spirits, was published in 2022 and is the basis of his talk today. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you back on campus.
I appreciate that.
It has been a few years, I understand.
Yeah, it's a few years, quite a few.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much for being here for this lecture series. Chief Justice Williams was adamant and thought it would be highly appropriate to have you here for this event, and we're certainly excited to have you and looking forward to the talk this afternoon.
Well, good. Frank Williams is a wonderful guy, and I'm just pleased to be here.
Thank you. All right, so we thought we'd just talk a little bit about your research and what led you to this point in your career. Your research interests revolve around history of race relations in the United States. Can you kind of tell us what drew you to this topic?
Well, probably growing up at the Delta, and then I was here at Mississippi State during a formative time when the university was integrated, and although oddly enough, I never took a class here on the Old South or the Civil War. I was always interested in those topics. And while doing a graduate paper, I discovered the story of a person held in slavery in Natchez who had been a prince in Africa. And so I began to research that, moved to Washington, worked more intently on it. And the first book I wrote, Prince Among Slaves, was produced from that project. That seminar paper I did here at MSU.
So it started with a project that you did
yes.
here at Mississippi State as a part of your doctoral work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. That's amazing. Throughout your career, you have conducted a great deal of research on Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. Tell us why you decided to focus on Booth.
Well, I've always liked biography. The book I did on the African prince was a biography. You know, started in Africa, came to America, went back to Africa in his life. I just like biography as a form. I think it engages people in history at a special level. You know, it's a human story, they're human, so those click. And Booth, I just got interested in when I realized, one, there was no biography of him. There were books on the murder, but, you know, not really on him. So some of these books were like, you know, you're looking at the tires, you're looking at the trim, you're looking at the seat covers, but you're not looking at the engine, right? So I wanted to do kind of an in-depth biography just to see what made him click, what made him tick, what type of person he really was. And being in Washington, you know, I had access to all the great materials at the National Archives and so forth. So just went and did that biography, and it was very, very interesting. I realized things about him I didn't know. He was a really very successful actor. Successful, which complicates an understanding of the murder because he was somebody with something to lose, not a born loser like most of these assassins are once you look at their lives. So, you know, he was an engaging person. He had lots of friends, professional success, money. He owned oil leases and bank stock and real estate. But he was just, you know, absorbed with this idea that Lincoln, oddly enough, was trying to make himself king. I know that sounds odd in 2022, but let's remember during the Civil War there was no term limits that hadn't been set up until later in the 20th century. So you could have an indefinite number if you could win the elections. And during Booth's lifetime, and he only lived 26 years old, he was 26 when he shot Lincoln and he was shot. During Booth's whole lifetime, no president had ever had a second term. So when Lincoln was elected for the second time, you know, that just triggered the worst fears in Booth, that Lincoln was trying to make himself a king in this country. And consequences of that belief were fatal.
Wow, that's amazing. And in your latest book, In the Houses of Their Dead, the Lincolns, the Booths, and the Spirits, of course you expand on the connections between the two. But also, you just mentioned about his obviously his death. You've done some work with Ford's Theater as well, in terms of the museum. And can you talk?
Yes,
elaborate on
it's
that?
an amazing structure located on 10th Street, not really very far from the White House. It was almost demolished after the murder because of associations with the crime. You know, just they felt it was better just to level it and build something new there, but they saved it. It was a government office building over the years. It was empty. It was a medical museum for time, and then finally they turned it, they reconstructed it, did really well, I think, and made it into a working theater. But it also has this historical component of, you know, connected with the Lincoln death. So there's an interesting relationship, right, between a working theater and a memorial to Lincoln and commemoration of the assassination. But it's a great place, very popular. It gets 500,000 visitors a year. People love to come, love to look at the scene of this great tragedy.
Wow. So it's still an operating theater as well as a museum.
Exactly.
But after he was assassinated, it closed in terms of it being a working theater?
Well, the government just grabbed the building because they wanted to
okay.
investigate the crime.
Right.
And the Ford family who owned it said, you know, we had nothing to do with this, and that proved true, you know, other than being unintended host of the assassination.
Right.
So the government finally paid them and bought the building, turned it into a, they renovated it entirely. They stripped all the theater part out,
Oh, wow.
put floors in for offices. And then there's a great tragedy, which I bring out in the book you're about to mention. In 1893, the interior floors collapsed. The fourth floor simply gave way and fell on the third, which hit the second, and all of below just cascaded into the basement of the building, killing over 20 government clerks. The building had been undermined. They were doing some construction work in the foundation,
Wow.
and the integrity of the building had been compromised. So you had this great tragedy at the site of the earlier tragedy, the Lincoln tragedy. So many people feel that's a cursed building.
Curse on the building,
in
right.
Washington.
Right. That's fascinating. I had no idea that it closed after the assassination. So obviously it makes sense.
Right.
Interesting. All right, so let's talk about In the Houses of Their Dead, the new book that's just come out that you're going to be talking about today. You draw throughout that book a lot of interesting connections between Lincoln and Booth, and
Right.
even get into spiritualism a little bit. Can you tell
Well,
us
I
a
think
little
it's
bit
been known by scholars for years that the Lincolns, particularly Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Lincoln, was interested in spiritualism. She lost 2 children, then finally a third one later on in her life. So she became fascinated with spiritualism. You know, the idea that she really hadn't lost them. Maybe she could still stay in touch with them. She could visit their spirits and so forth. I didn't know until I did the Booth book that the Booth family was also into spiritualism. And they even shared some of the same mediums. They even went to the same people, which added another context, you know, another relationship, another link between the Lincolns and the Booths. And particularly one rather unsavory character named Charles Colchester, who fascinated the Lincolns with his ability to summon the spirit of their dead son, Willie, but at the same time was an intimate friend of John Wilkes Booth. And amazingly enough, Colchester, who was a little bit of who was dishonest, I think, but not essentially an evil person. He didn't like what he was hearing from Booth, and he told Lincoln, you know, I really think you should be careful, you know, with yourself. And, you know, Colchester liked Booth enough never to mention Booth's name to Lincoln, but he did in a general way. And I think probably he relieved his conscience by telling Lincoln just to be careful. And when another person told Lincoln, I think you should be cautious about your life, Lincoln said, you know, Colchester's been telling me that for months. So
Wow.
that was the one warning of many he received that I think he should have heeded.
It's a little foreshadowing there.
Exactly.
So how did you uncover that aspect of Booth and the connection and Colchester?
Well, Colchester was holding seances, public seances and private ones in Washington in the last months of the war. So he actually advertised in the newspapers. And it was known from some of Lincoln's friends that Colchester did visit the Lincolns, particularly Mrs. Lincoln, but also the president. And then I found a document in the archives a police report saying, we need to look into this Colchester character. Where is he? He was a friend of Booth's. He was in Booth's hotel room. Booth actually got him a part-time acting job at Ford's Theater at one point. But when they came to look for Colchester, he had wisely disappeared from Washington and was not to be found.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's a wonderful story. I enjoyed putting stories like that in the new book.
Right. So I guess throughout the book you've got different stories like that.
Exactly. I developed who these people. Colchester was an English immigrant, for example. The Booth family was very interested in omens and having their fortune told and stuff like that. Mary and Abraham Lincoln were very superstitious people. I'll talk a little bit about that. Lincoln was afraid of the number 13, for example. Once Lincoln, when he was young, he came to a table to join some fellows for lunch, and he realized he would be the 13th person there, and he said, I can't do it.
Really?
I'll see you guys later.
So he left?
Yeah, he did. And one of the guys said, as Lincoln walked out, one guy said, I'd rather be dead than be that superstitious. I guess nothing came between him and a good meal.
That's right. That's an interesting part of Lincoln that I'm sure is a little known fact.
Yeah.
I was actually talking to the chief. We were talking about the book yesterday, and he said, and Virginia echoed this as well, that they realized that and remembered that Mary Todd was superstitious and believed in spiritualism, but didn't realize as much that Lincoln was himself a spiritualist, or thought about it, or put some weight in it.
Good point. He was, in contrast with his wife, he was less traditionally religious and more skeptically minded about things. There's no doubt about that. And his law partner Herndon said you really had to prove something to him. He had a hard time taking anything on faith. And so spiritualism would not be an easy fit for him. But some of these spiritualists were either very good at what they did or were so sincere in what they did that it made you think twice about what you were experiencing or what you were seeing. Colchester is widely conceived to be a charlatan. He had tricks he would use. One thing that mystified Lincoln, Colchester seemed to be able to produce noises from the wall in front of you. And Lincoln was so confused about that he asked Colchester to go over and meet with Joseph Henry, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and let the scientists look at this basically. And of course, unfortunately for Colchester, Joseph Henry was an expert in acoustics. That actually was his specialty, as well as a noted critic of spiritualism. And so Colchester went to the Smithsonian, the beautiful old main Smithsonian building on the mall,
Right.
where Henry had his office, and performed his routine for Henry. And Professor Henry had to report back to Lincoln, I got to say right now, I don't know how he's doing this. I think it's him, but I can't prove it. Then in later years, Henry found out Colchester had a device on his biceps, which he could flex without a sitter like you and I. You wouldn't notice that I was moving my biceps muscle, but it produced a noise that seemed independent of the person. And so that was how Henry later explained, where that noise came from. Unfortunately, Lincoln was long dead by that point, so there wasn't anything more to say.
That's quite interesting that he could develop a tool like that would help him with his craft at that point in time, which is amazing. So how long did it take you to put together the book?
This book, not too long. This was In the Houses of the Dead. It was the quickest book I've ever written and the easiest book I've ever written, and I think the most fun one I've ever written. Because these are very colorful characters. And you're dealing with unusual and eccentric episodes in their lives. And one thing I did was, I took them seriously. I have my own opinions on all these things, but the book isn't about me, it's about them, right? And if they were sincere in what they were doing, and some of them absolutely were, if they were sincere, and were taken seriously by others, I just presented them as their contemporaries found them, be that good or be that bad, So it's written not indulgently, but with an understanding that that's how people were at that time, and that's not now, and it's not my job to make fun of these people.
Right.
I couldn't imagine anything more boring to write or to read, than somebody doing that in 2022. But it was a very fun project. It only took about 3 years, I would say.
3 years, okay. And one final question about in the houses of their dead. So I would think doing research on these characters, these individuals, since much of that information is not all obviously in one location, would be difficult. Did you have to go to a variety of different archives to do that research?
Yes, you really had to scratch around a little bit, because the spiritualists were, fortunately for researchers, very generally literary people. There were a lot of spiritualist newspapers during the Civil War era, weekly newspapers that published accounts of mediums traveling here and visiting there, and people writing in saying, "You won't believe what happened to me. I met with Colchester and he told me so and so." And so those were very, very helpful. And of course, so much of that is loaded up online now.
Right.
That you can do a lot of newspaper research from your own library.
That's
or
right.
Come to a wonderful place like this.
Right, that's right. That's right. And we appreciate you giving a shout out to the
Absolutely.
archivist and to the libraries. That's obviously a lot of what we do, is trying to make materials and resources available. So,
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks.
Looking forward to the Franklin Virginia Williams lecture on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies and your talk. Hope that you'll come back again soon. Maybe not take as long in coming back as you did this time.
That sounds good. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for joining us today.